Welcome to the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and with me, as always, is Mr. Backroads Bill. Bill, how are you today?
I'm doing so well, Ben. Today we're going to mine some nuggets from the past, the present, and the future, and I think we'll go all the way enriched.
So today's episode is really cool. We are honored to have Roy Slack joining us virtually today by the power of the internet. Roy was the president of Cementation. He's now retired, but he's still on the board. So Roy, you're pretty much semi-retired at this point, right?
Semi-retired.
Yeah.
Still busy.
Still very busy. We had you on to North Bay with Love, another Echo show. I think that was at the beginning of November, and you guys were doing, you and Mark Wagner were doing the mining week for CIM. How did that go?
Kicking off mining week, and that committee has done a fantastic job. And every week, there's more activities. There's more kids that get introduced to mining. So it was a great success.
Yeah, and the thing I find really interesting is I'm getting introduced to the mining world since I started this job. Mining is huge in Ontario, but specifically in North Bay, as it's kind of the headquarters for a lot of huge mining companies. And it was kind of cool. So we went out to Kananaskis before we launched Echo to do some on-site podcasting for Bring It to the Surface. I'm sure you know that initiative. It's basically mental health within mining. And you talk to these people and you expect them to come from Vancouver and Calgary and Halifax, like all over. And most people were either out of North Bay or out of Quebec. So it was kind of like, it's kind of crazy. Like even here we have like Redpath, Bort Longyear, Cementation, a lot of huge global companies that headquarter right here in North Bay.
I remember visiting Ghana in Northwest Africa and meeting all the Canadians, they called them. The people from Canada. And then you go down to Perth, and I met a young engineer that went to the same high school I did.
Oh, really?
So it's the mining industry, the Canadian mining industry is well respected globally.
Absolutely.
And you see Canadians all over the world.
So in this episode, it was kind of a story that posed the question of what happens to mines when they get closed down? How do we give that kind of land back to nature? And so yes, the focus is going to be on the Renabie Gold Mine. But Roy, first, I want to just ask you, why does a mine get abandoned in the first place?
Well, I think if we go back, back in the day or in the old days, once a mine was mined out, once the ore body was no longer profitable, there was no reason for the mining companies to be there. So mining is not a renewable resource. So once an ore body is mined out, the mining company leaves. All of the community infrastructure that was there to support the mining company leaves too. And it's been a real challenge over the years where communities that were booming 20 years later are ghost towns. And there's a guy named Backroads Bill who goes around and finds these ghost towns for us. I don't know if you know him.
Oh, I think I've met him once or twice.
Okay.
What's your connection with each other?
Roy, we have probably the most important connection as far as it goes to with regards to education, because a long time ago in a faraway land, we had this idea that we should educate teachers. We concluded that teachers over the lifetime of their career can tell their students about modern mining, and that was the common denominator. Not only Roy as president of a company, but then with the Canadian Institute of Mining, we saw that we needed to take teachers on tours, and we exposed them to modern mining and the four pillars of mining, modern mining being the world of work, occupations, the environment, safety, and technology. And that hasn't really changed. And to this day, we're still doing the mining tours. But Roy was instrumental in listening, and then we needed some funding, and we got it going. And I think that's it's really, really important. You can read reports and you can look at videos, but I don't think you really can experientially, if you want to grasp what modern mining is all about, you need to go to the site. And not only the site, North Bay is a perfect example with more than, I believe now, 40 service type manufacturing industries that support mining around the world. So that's the connection. And I'm glad, as far as the Canadian Ecology Centre is concerned, that we've been able to do our small part in educating certainly teachers and others about modern mining.
Yeah, Bill had this format, and Bill, you were doing it with the forestry industry before, and you came and talked to us and said, "What about the mining industry?" And right away we thought it was a great idea. We'd been reaching out to students, but the teachers were a gap. We weren't reaching out to them, and of course they've got a huge influence. I think all of us can tell a story about one or two teachers who made a difference in our life, and so Bill's concept, Canadian Ecology Centre's concept of a teacher's tour was a great fit for us. So we were happy to support it any way we could.
Absolutely. So we were talking again about the Renabie Gold Mine. So Bill, we'll start with, because you wrote your whole story on this. What is the history behind this mine? What made it so special for you?
Yeah, I think today we're gonna mine some nuggets from the past, the present, and more importantly, the future. But Renabie is situated between Chapleau and Wawa, towards the village of Missinabie. And it was a gold mine, like many gold mines in Northern Ontario. It has a history, very productive. Went through peaks and troughs. It was actually closed during the Second World War, revitalized, and on it went. And then, of course, as Roy has mentioned, at certain time that the ore body is no longer, I think, profitable, it closed down. But there's a critical time in the early 90s, and particularly 1992 in the Ontario Mining Act in Ontario, where Renabie represents the first mine that had to undergo a closure plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, and Roy will explain that mines could no longer walk away from their site. And there's more to that, as I said, to that. Before then, we have literally thousands of old mines and adits across the landscape that are out there, and the government has a program where they mitigate those problem areas. And there are big ones, and there are small ones, even in our North Bay area, on the Manitou Islands, the niobium or the uranium mine that was there. That head frame was taken down, and I think, in all intents and purposes, it is back to its natural state as it was before they did that kind of resource extraction. But nonetheless, Renabie is a good example of where, if you go there today, and I often say I would like to take people there and have blindfolds on, and you take the blindfolds off, you would never know, as far as the mine site is concerned, that there was ever a mine there. So there are other obviously challenges in and around a mine site, like the tailings. But so Renabie again represents that initial example where mines can no longer, and to this day, I mean, these closure plans are so extensive. And of course, there's also the posting of bonds that the money has to be there to do that closure plan. But at Renabie is that, and it's a great place to go and see something that was, but then is no longer really there.
Yeah, certainly. There was a time where nobody was worried about the environment, and I mean nobody. So mining companies would finish up at a mine and leave. A lot of people in the community would leave. The government didn't worry about it. The mining company didn't worry about it. And probably the only people that worried about it were a few people that stayed after the closure. And so, like Bill said, over the years, a number of these properties were left. And as a society, not just an industry, but as a society, as we became more environmentally aware, we started to say, well, this isn't right. And there were a number of mining companies doing things before the act that Bill talked about was legislated, but it wasn't universal. So you'd have some companies that would be conscientious about the local community, and others that, when they were done, they quite possibly they had no money to do anything after. So my own perspective on it, I'm a taxpayer. And even though I'm retired, I still pay taxes. I don't know what your situation is, Bill, but I know I still pay taxes. And I don't want to pay for this. I don't want a mining company to make a bunch of money and then leave, and then us as taxpayers have to clean up. So the legislation just made sense, and I think what spurred it is just societal environmental awareness in general. And when we talk, one of the things we talk about in safety, if there's something legislated and we want to do something different, we talk about doing something equal or better than. And the same applies for mine closures. There is a legislated minimum requirement, but I think a lot of companies now are looking at for example, there's some companies that are using wind power, and when the mine is done, those turbines will be given to the community. So the local community will be able to generate power. There are things that mining companies can do, not just to return the property to its natural state, but to benefit the community in the long run. So I think we're meeting legislation now and we're going beyond that. The other thing I'll add is that Canada is a leader in this area. I mean, there's mines all over the world that have just been left. And Canada has not only got legislation to prevent that in the future, but is looking at cleanup now. And I will say, Bill, and you alluded to it, some of the projects are huge in terms of cleanup. And I don't know, quite honestly, I don't know how they'll get done. I've seen a few of them that the government has looked at and has budgeted for, but it's a big challenge. So it's very important that existing mines, new mines, are legislated and are going to return sites to their natural condition.
Do people, because they know that they have to do, so we're talking about the 1992 Mining Act as well. So that's the act that Roy and Bill were talking about. That kind of forces, instead of the taxpayers to do it, the actual mine to fund it. Because that's correct, right, Roy?
Yes.
Okay. See, I listen. I pay attention.
You listen and you understand. That's even better than most people.
Now I lost my train of thought. So what I was going to say is, now that they know that they have to do this stuff once it closes, and actually I'll ask this question first. What is the average lifespan of a mine?
Oh, I don't think there's any average. I'll tell you a quick story. I visited a friend in Windsor. The Windsor salt mine is there. And I asked him, what's the mining plan? And he said, we're going that way for 50 years. Like when it comes to salt or potash, they're huge deposits. Gold mines are certainly different. I mean, I was up in Hemlo in the mid-'80s when those mines first opened. And Williams is still operating, but it's kind of near the end of its life. So, those mines have operated 35 years. We've seen some mines operate 50. The Sudbury camp, I mean, that's been going for, 100 years now. So there's, I don't know if there's any average. You can have some mines that operate for 10 years. You can have some mines that have been operating for 100.
So when people make a mine now, do they keep in mind what they have to do to restore it after? Is there any difference in how they open it now versus how they used to open it before this act was put out?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Closure plans are legislated and bonding is required to make sure that the money is there to execute the closure plan. Before permits are issued, the closure plan has to be reviewed and approved. There has to be consultation with the community, which in many cases in Canada involves Indigenous partnerships and Indigenous consultation. So there's a lot of things that have to be done before permits are even issued to begin to build a mine. And the closure plan is one of the most important elements of that.
It was interesting you said that, because that actually was going to lead into my next thought was, it feels like mining, and I don't know if this is a legislation thing or not, but it feels like mining is very respectful of First Nations land. I know that you're part of the Ring of Fire, which is a very kind of infamous thing that's going on right now. Can you just kind of explain that process between the First Nations people and companies that are trying to open mines?
I think there's a lot of ways to frame it, but companies that respect the communities they work in. So if you leave the Indigenous element off the table for a minute, you should respect the community you're working in and the people in that community. And if that community is an Indigenous community, then you have to seek to understand what their needs are. And the different communities have different needs. You can't generalize there. You really have to engage with the local communities and understand. But it really comes down, like, if you engage with the community that you're working in, they're going to be supplying you with labor. They're going to be supplying you with materials, with services. You need a strong relationship there. And the Indigenous element is an important part for us in Canada. A lot of our operations are remote, and a lot of our operations impact Indigenous communities. And when I say impact, we often think of that as environmental, but from an economic standpoint, there's an impact. Young people in the community, once they start working at the mines, they have an option now to move. And you see an exodus of young people from northern communities once they get some money and some experience. Those are all things that we have to consider when we engage with the community.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I've noticed too, the more I kind of understand the mining industry, is even though it's everything, the whole world runs on money and economics and all that stuff, but it feels like the mining world is very respectful, as we've just been talking about. Yes, they're trying to make money, but they try to do it with environmental thoughts in mind and with the impact it has on the people who are living there.
Yes, I'm on the Environmental Social Governance Committee of Torex, and we really try and focus on win-win solutions. What I mean by that is, for example, they're implementing solar power at their operation in Mexico, which will reduce their carbon footprint, but will also reduce their operating costs. So you have a 3-year payback on an installation, and after that point, your power draw will be less and you will be saving money on your operations. So doing something that's good for the environment, good for the community, and good for the shareholder. And I think that's what mining companies are really getting to with ESG now is how can we create win-win situations with regard to the environment and with regard to the other stakeholders.
And Bill, I know you're a huge environmental activist and stuff. So I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of on what Roy's been saying about mining and the respect they have and what they're trying to do in terms of not just community, because you're obviously you have a lot of interest as well in First Nations and how, like, the respect of the land in general. So I just wanted to kind of get your take on that.
Yeah, Renabie is a good example where there's a relationship between the Missinaba Cree First Nation and Barrick Gold, who owns the property. It's described as a working relationship. I don't know what that really means, but companies, historic properties often now they go back and reinvestigate, certainly the tailings or underground too, because technology has changed, and so Detour Gold Mine is a perfect example of that. So for First Nations across Northern Ontario, not just the Ring of Fire, but there are so many new. Rainy River Gold, for instance, is one where there's it's owned by the Indigenous First Nations of the area. So across the board, there's all these relationships, and I think that's another thing people need to kind of understand a bit more. Roy did not mention it, but we do, in the beginning of our tours and things, we really had to dispel that pick and shovel kind of imagery we had of mining, because modern mining now is almost behind the joystick with regards to all the remote control devices and the use of applied technology above and the surface and below. And so I know in Timmins, in the downtown Timmins, and Roy said, we can talk about, when that's mined out, it's going to become a lake and a recreational area. I mean, we look at the Sudbury Basin, the regreening in Sudbury, albeit it took a long time, is now a world-class example of repairing something in essence. And I know Dr. Graham Spires right now is in Peru or Bolivia talking about that too. As Roy said, there are mines around the world, but Canada is definitely a leader, and of course, I think many countries and people can learn from that. So those relationships do exist, and a couple of things that also came to mind. The messaging now I find from the industry, the mining industry, I think for young people, because there is a shortage of workers, and we could talk about this forever. There's a shortage of workers across the board in most sectors of the economy, but in mining, the messaging now. And younger people will say they need to know that they can make a difference environmentally if they take a career in mining. They can also make a difference in their career understanding the applications of technology. The gold mine near Chapleau, the scoop trams, if my memory serves me right, are all electrified now, Roy. And so there's those kinds of examples. But those relationships on the land, in the communities, do exist, and I think that's one thing. The Renabie story, not only something happened, but now again, all these by legislation, people cannot walk away. And of course, we often say if it's not mined, it's grown, and if it's not grown, it's mined. And any room we sit in, if you looked around, that's probably the case.
So, because we talked about this a couple of times, and with how, of course, there's kind of worldwide mines, a lot in South America. What is the difference between coming to a mine in Canada and going to a mine in South America, Roy? And especially when it comes to like this kind of environmental impact, is it one of those things where when you go and you see some of these things that are made in China and it's like almost like sweatshop kind of thing, or is there still a lot of is it still the kind of same environment as you see up here?
I think there's a lot of stereotypes, and we tend to generalize. If you go to South America, I'll just give you a couple examples. You go to South America and you've got Codelco in Chile, one of the largest, or I do believe the largest copper producer in the world. Ultra modern mining, huge operations, very sophisticated. Some of you remember the Chilean mine rescue, where the miners were trapped at the San Jose mine. So that mine is in Chile as well. Excuse me. But at the other end of the scale. So you've got, from the most modern operations in the world to some of the most, if you want to say, backward or small operations. That's all in the same country. So hard to generalize. We see a full range. And of course, there's Canadian mining companies mining in these countries as well. And a lot of Canadian mining companies implement what we call TSM, Total Sustainable Mining, which is a Mining Association of Canada standard. So, how's the saying go? A little more Canada is always good. If Canadian companies operating globally and Canadian companies operating globally bring Canadian standards around the world. And so, that's a great thing. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you kind of did, yeah.
There's no answer to it, really, because there's such a wide range of different operations globally.
I think the big thing you just said, Roy, was that if it's a Canadian company, they have those standards. So if they run a mine in Canada or in South America, it's the same, right? Like that's kind of what you were saying there?
There's local legislation. So you've got to follow local legislation to start with. A number of mining companies are signed on to MAX, to the Mining Association of Canada's system. There are other groups. The World Gold Council, for example, has standards they've set up, which of course would be specific to gold mining and some of the things that are involved in that. So, and ICMM, the International Council of Metals and Minerals, has set up standards as well with NGOs, with different groups, including the Church of England and United Nations, to guide mining companies in general in terms of reclamation, in terms of environmental stewardship. So there's lots happening there to globalize an environmentally sound approach to mining.
We're going on a tour to Nickel Rim South, which is now being kind of idled down to care and maintenance. But it's and actually cementation played a big role in putting that mine on the map, so to speak. But its environmental footprint, albeit the rock is taken away for refinement, it's a very, very, when you go there, it's a very, very small footprint. Not all mines are like that because the rock has to be crushed and refined, so to speak. But again, if I had one wish, and I still believe this in all my heart, is that if you could take people out to see operations, modern mines, you'd come away with a different perspective of mining today. Certainly in Canada. And that's something that's what we strive to do. So going back to Renabie, that's an example where a line was drawn in the sand, and from that point going forward, things got better. They're not always perfect. We keep learning and doing, and I think that's important when we look at history.
Okay, so before I let you guys go, I just wanted to get your perspectives on, we've talked about what has been happening and how we're trying to get some of these abandoned mines reclaimed within nature. What would you like to see in the future? I'll start with you, Bill.
I think again, I kind of summarized it a little earlier about people need to pay attention to mineral resources, because again, if it's not mined, it's grown, and if it's not grown, it's mined. That's pretty much our consumptive lifestyle that we lead. And so the exposure to modern mining, we should not look at the sins of the past all the time. We should look at the future and what can be done better and better each day out. And I think the hundreds, and I dare say probably of occupations, direct or indirect, related to mining, these people are compassionate. I think they don't get up in the morning to rape and pillage the landscape. They get up with, how can we make this better, depending on what you're doing, and apply again whether it's the environmental standards or the technology to make for a better day. And I think we should learn more about modern mining. At the same time, when we look at the past, I was just doing a Backroads Bill adventure. One was at Larder Lake the other day, where I found the cave, although he had built his name's Charlie Ross, a prospector. He'd built a cabin kind of like an annex to the cave, but the floor of the cave was littered with quartz, where you could tell he was pounding away with his hammer. Then I went right across Highway 11 on Highway 66 and found the cave that Jake Davidson lived in. Again, he had built, the caves actually looked the same. He built a cabin off of that too. And of course, he was paramount in opening the young Davidson mine. So we look at the romantic part of mining, but then we fast forward to where we are now. So it's a good continuum.
So Roy, is somebody who's in the industry and who's really has a big foot in the environmental impact, and with all the things that you're on, what would you say that you guys are working on as an industry to better the environment, but also where would you love to see the mining industry go to continue this project?
I think I can answer both questions with one answer.
Perfect.
And what we're legislated to do is return the land to its previous condition. And I don't have the wording for that exactly right, but what we want to do is leave things better than when we got there. And there's a lot of ways we can do that. You start to think about it environmentally, and you can return the land to its former condition. You can encourage both species and plant life that may not have been there but would thrive and would make it a better ecosystem. not my area of expertise, but to go beyond that, how do you leave the community better off than when you got there? That could be road access, that could be power, that could be creating companies that can provide for other mining companies after the local mine is gone. There are lots of ways we can engage with the community and make things better than they were. So I think that's being done now, but ideally that becomes a standard. And that's what I'd like to see. And the other thing, if we go back to purpose, and I always like to mention this to people, is sometimes people see mining as part of the problem regarding climate change. Mining didn't create the issues we're in now, but mining will be the solution.
That's a really interesting thing.
Yeah, the technologies that are needed for us to get away from a fossil fuel-based economy have to be mined. Simple as that. And so mining, and that's why there's lots of talk about critical minerals, the different things we're doing, but mining will be the solution, and young people can be part of that solution. So
that was like a mind-blowing fact. I didn't even think about that, the way you portray it. And I think that's when you think of how people, I think you said it, but the perception that people have with mining, and it's a negative perception because you think of fossil fuels and that gets mined and all this kind of stuff. But it is really interesting to think in a different light that, it kind of is a solution for our future. And mining's always going to be there, right? It's never going to go away. It's crucial for what we need. And, way in the future, it's going to be huge when it comes to when we can mine in space and get minerals off world, right? Maybe 30 years.
Don't get me started. Don't get me started on space. We're still trying to figure out earth mining. So,
oh man. Well, maybe in our lifetime we'll see that. I don't know. We'll see it. They're starting to send people to the moon, so that's going to be pretty cool. But
I've got a list. I've got a list of people I'd like to send to the moon. Me and Ralph Cramden, Is that the Honeymooners? Bill, do you remember that show?
That's right.
To the Moon, Alice?
Yeah, to the Moon, Alice. Yeah.
I digress again.
Maybe we'll have you back on, Roy, to do a space mining episode.
Oh, yeah. Me and George Jetson will. That'll be a great panel for a space mining.
Honestly, it wouldn't shock me if you were the head of space mining 20 years from now. And it's just Roy Slack right on the top of it.
Yeah. Oh, okay. That would shock me.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Roy, today.
No, it was great. Yeah, I always like to catch up with Bill and yourself, Ben, and so it was great to be on.
Well, big thank you to Roy Slack for taking the time out of his day to give us some great insight on the topic of mining and mine reclamation. If you're looking for more Backroads Bill content, we release a new episode every single Wednesday on all of the popular podcast players and on NorthBayEcho.ca, where you can also check out other North Bay podcasts like our flagship show To North Bay with Love, where yesterday Lisa sat down with a couple of local journalists, including our very own Dave Dale, who's the content director here at North Bay Echo, to talk about a case that was pretty big in the community here, the Sheldon Forget a case that was highly publicized, and they kind of talk about how they covered it and kind of the ins and outs of how you can go around covering that unbiased and trying to do the best you can as a reporter. So very interesting podcast episode. You can check that out again, as the same as this podcast, on any of your favorite players or at NorthBayEcho.ca. So, Bill, before we leave, any last words?
Well, Ben, we've covered a lot of territory today with Roy Slack, and I think people will come away with a better understanding not only of Renabie, but of what modern mining is all about here in Northern Ontario.